Hello and welcome to episode 24. Episode 24 of 4 Random Books. And to be honest, this is going out in February. So that's rather a long time away. Fun though. So today we are going to be looking at Defense, Money and Policy. So we're going to start off with Maritime Dominion. It's and the Triumph of the Free World. It's written by Peter Padfield, and it's about naval campaigns that shaped the modern world 1852 to 2001. So let's consider what campaigns are in here. There's the British Empire, the Russian Crimean War, the Indian Mutiny, the American Civil War, Pax Britannica, Aspirant Navies, the United States, Aspirant Navies, Imperial Japan, Aspirant Navies, Imperial Germany, Tsushima in 1905, Long Range Gunnery, Towards Armageddon, War Coronel in the Falklands 1914, The Dogger Bank 1915, Jutland 1916, BT, Jutland 1916, Jellicoe, Unrestricted U-Boat War 1917, The Baton Passes, Hitler's War 1939, The Warlords, The Battle of the Atlantic 1940-1, The Pacific 1942, Midway 1942, Allied Victory 1943-5, The Cold War and After. Now, apart from thinking that the baton passes some point in the 1920s, which seems to be absolute twaddle, don't take this the wrong way. There is definitely joining up and all these things. But the US Congress is never going to give the amount of money at the time. Well, unless it was giving the money it was supposed to, then there might be a chance of saying the baton passes, but actually not really. It's one of those interesting things. The idea is this sort of baton passes. No, in many ways, the baton passing is the end of World War II, the sort of the after effects of World War II, baton passing. But no, it's still a very interesting book. It's got some lovely pictures in it. It hasn't happened in the previous ones before, but hey, it'll do. It's got a lovely artist's impression of Togo on his bridge in it. And it's in... All you need to know really about this book's take on many things is the fact that it has Alfred Taylor Mahan as a picture of him. But it is, many ways, it's a good book. It's worth reading, but, and I say this with all kindness in my heart, it is a very, in fact, I would say a very early Mahanian take on things, and it's an initial take on what Mahan says, traditional take on what Mahan says, i.e. him being a battle centrist, where everything is about the battle kind of guy, and that is fair to an extent, but he does have some subtlety that especially creeps into his later works when he can afford subtlety. Because you must remember, his works are about making the case for a navy for the United States. As for Turgot's tactics, although none of the British observers remarked on it, there were echoes of Nelson's unorthodox approach at Trafalgar in the centenary year. Turgot was confronted, as Nelson had been, by a numerically more powerful but less rigorously trained fleet, and risked a manoeuvre of considerable danger within effective range of the enemy guns in order to concentrate each of his two divisions on the flagships of the enemy, as Nelson had done. As at Trafalgar, this created confusion in the enemy fleets, and like Nelson, he had allowed independence to his second division, the Lee column in Nelson's case. Turgot was an admirer of Nelson, and his signal and exaltation to the fleet was a conscious emulation of Nelson's England expects. Okay, so this book is worth reading. And I know there's a bit of skepticism leaking through here. It is a good book. As said, I'm not sure about everything in it, but it is a good book, and a lot of people have read it, so it gets quite bad like me. Far less read by people Is Men, Money and Diplomacy, The Evolution of British Strategic Foreign Policy 1919 to 1926 by John Robert Ferris. I really like this book, but it is far less well read than that one. That one, and it is a very good piece of popular history, which isn't a bad thing, but it is. In November 1918, Britain possessed incomparably the strongest navy on Earth and one of the largest armies and air forces. Down to 1926, it led the world in the development of naval aviation and strategic bombing forces. The Navy remained larger than the USN and equaled any of the other two fleets combined. Only France had a significantly larger air force, while the British and Indian armies fielded 400,000 regular soldiers. Dominions and overseas paramilitary units, which garrisoned most of the empire, and the territorial army provided another 400,000. Although by 1931 the relative strength of Britain's services had fallen, its aggregate military strength and expertise remained formidable. It has been argued that during the 1920s the services misunderstood the value of the modern arms, which were to be so crucial in war. In fact, there was room for a debate about these matters. It was not self-evident that battleships were nearing obsolescence, or that strategic bombing, naval aviation, and armoured forces were on the way of the future. None of these arms had reached maturity during the Great War, and each had technical limitations which were not overcome until after 1935. During the 1920s, the services were made many errors regarding these issues. The Army overestimated the value of cavalry and underestimated that of armoured forces, as the Navy did regarding battleships and naval aviation. The RAF exaggerated the importance of strategic bombing and minimized that of ground and sea support. How the services did want to prepare for the future, and their attitude towards new material like helicopters was progressive. They recognized that modern arms were important and would significantly affect the nature of operations. They overemphasized material aspects when considering these issues, and misunderstood the full effects of these modern arms. Still, their theoretical and practical attitudes were no worse than any other of the world's armed forces. The fate of service policies hinged on the government's view of imperial security. This could be endangered should any power control certain seas or threaten Britain's possessions with land or air attack. Whitehall expected services to meet three needs: imperial policing, to overcome minor internal and external problems; deterrence, to convince other powers not to risk an attack on British vital interests; and insurance, to defend these interests should deterrence fail, and also to mobilize Britain's strategic resources. The army was maintained only for the purpose of imperial policing and insurance, but the Navy and the RAF met all three of these needs, especially deterrence. The government regarded air power as the basis for home defence and deemed sea power the foundation for imperial security. However, there were differences over the nature of Britain's maritime needs. BT stated that any country's authority in the councils of the world depends primarily on her naval strength, and the Admiralty wanted to retain Britain's traditional maritime supremacy. Conversely, many politicians and the Treasury wished only to defend imperial home waters against likely threats. Decision makers often drew analogies to commercial insurance when considering Britain's strategic needs. Warren Fisher argued that we cannot insure against everything, whether as a country or as a private individuals, not merely because we cannot afford it, but also because that would not be insurance. Conversely, Bridgman held that when a man insures his house or his car, he endeavours to secure for himself the value of either in the event of their destruction. The premium he pays is one which the company regards as sufficient to provide that sum. If his car is worth £1,000, he does not say, "I do not think my car is likely to be smashed, and therefore I will insure it for 500. He pays his premium in order to recover the full amount of his loss. In our case, we have to secure ourselves against a defeat ruinous to our nation empire, which cannot be commuted in pounds, shillings, and pence, or a costly war in which we may ultimately succeed, but which might cost us in actual expenses of war and resultant loss of trade, perhaps 6 million. As against such a premium risks a premium of about 1% in the former case, and a great deal less in the former case, and a great deal less in the latter, does not seem excessive." This is a good book. Read them together, you start to get a good picture. But add in the third one, and really though, when you combine those two books with this one, Andrew Field's Royal Navy Strategy in the Far East, 1919 to 1939, Planning for War Against Japan, you get a really good idea of what's going on. Suggested British naval countermeasures therefore centred on the need to show a strong interest in the region through a defended base at Singapore, even though permanently basing a battle fleet in the Far East was out of the question. It was again strongly recommended that the main fleet be concentrated in the Mediterranean, ready to move east or west, and that refueling facilities en route to Singapore be improved. Adequate fuel reserves in and en route to the Pacific not only make it possible for our fleet to preserve British interests in the East in the event of war with Japan and safeguard Hong Kong, Singapore and Australia, but also permit us, in a not unlikely event of hostilities between Japan and America, to retain our fleet in a central position such as the Mediterranean, ready to reinforce either east or west as strategic necessity may dictate. A lot of the pre-war thinking of the Royal Navy in terms of the 1920s and 1930s was thinking actually that there's going to be a massive war between the Americans and the Japanese, and they're probably going to have to deal with its fallout. That was a very real contingency they were looking at. A very real one they were considering. With the base at Singapore developed, Britain could not delay its hand until the last minute. It could delay playing its hand until the last minute. A weaker position with fewer facilities in place necessitated the sending of a fleet earlier, which might have drawn Britain into the war, as this deployment could have been taken as a provocative action by the Japanese. As already stated, some thought was also given to this position of the battle fleet in the event of war, and the bulk of the Far Eastern fleet was to be drawn from their training. The battlecruisers and 6 cruisers from the Mediterranean were to steam east to Singapore to reinforce the China station immediately, followed by a depot ship, flotilla leader, 16 destroyers, 6 submarines from the Atlantic Fleet, all of which would proceed to reinforce Hong Kong. A further 4 submarines would proceed to Singapore. All available battleships would be commissioned, along with at least 6 submarines, 3 destroyer flotillas, and all aircraft carriers, mine layers, and minesweepers in reserve. The 1919 plans had proposed that the Mobile Naval Base Defense Organization ship, the former battleship Agincourt, was to be commissioned and proceed to Aden to prepare anchorages in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. And although Agincourt was scrapped as part of the Washington settlement, the provision of a permanent anchorages would still be needed. Although still not a strategic plan, this formed the basis of a 1924 memorandum, and preparations and redeployments went ahead. In 1923, a strategic review of the great distribution of the fleet took place. Following the conclusion of the Great War, the Admiralty had stationed its 6 battleships in the Mediterranean to support policies there and retain the rest in the Atlantic Fleet. Stationing more ships there would have cost more. Now, however, it's become possible to suggest a gradual redistribution of the battle strength in accordance with the requirements of the strategy. As these requirements must mainly depend on the distribution of naval forces of foreign powers, these will be first be considered. With the United States Navy Pacific Fleet unable to develop a naval base in the Western Pacific nearer than Pearl Harbor, the Royal Navy, by virtue of the Singapore base, was the only power capable of countering any future aggressive tendencies of Japan, but it is neither feasible, economical, nor desirable to base our main naval strength in the Far East today. Mobility must therefore be the keystone of our strategy, by which it is meant that the fleet must be capable of making as rapid a passage as possible to the threatened area. Speed. This one is another cool one. This is Military Innovation in the Interwar Period, edited by Williamson, Murray, and Allan R. Millet. It's got chapters written such as Armoured Warfare, the British, French, and German Experiences by Williamson Murray. Assault from the Sea, Development of Amphibious Warfare Between the Wars, the American, British, and Japanese Experiences by Allan R. Millet. Strategic Bombing, the British, American, and German Experiences, Williamson Murray. Close Air Support, the German, British, and American Experiences, 1918 to 1941 by Richard R. Muller. Adopting the Aircraft Carrier, the British, American, and Japanese Case Studies, Geoffrey Till. Innovation Ignored, the Submarine Problem, Germany, Britain, and the United States, 1919 to 1939 by Holger H. Herwig. From Radio to Radar, Interwar Military Adaptation to Technological Change in Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States by Alan Beckian. Innovation, Past and Future by Williamson Murray. Patterns of Military Innovation in the Warsaw Period by Allan R. Millet. Military Innovation and Peacetime, Barry Watts and Williamson Murray. It's actually a very cool book. I have to say I don't agree with one chapter I have issues with, but the rest are broadly interesting. Under Captain Morn's direction, the Inter-Service Training and Development Center, ISTCD, TC, gave landing craft development its highest priority. Working with shipbuilders, Whites, Cowles, and Thornycroft, ISTDC sponsored the construction of the prototype landing craft assault LCA, which went through several modifications but remained under 40 feet in length and 10 tons in preloaded weight. The ISTDC also had Thornycroft produce a 20-ton landing craft mechanized, which might be carried by the sturdier cranes and davits of converted cargo ships. As World War II began, the British urgently accelerated work on the LCA and LCM variants, but also began increasingly to concentrate on breaching ships and craft that did not require carrier ships and could sail from friendly harbour to unfriendly beach with embarked vehicles and supplies. It's a very, very cool book. All four together give you a nice idea of this period and of the change that went round. This book is good for context around which these three books are good for the specifics and the content. And that is sometimes what you need in a book set, a good mix. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time for another Build Trumps. Not Build Trumps, Brew Ships. Sorry, I had a lot of recording this morning. Brew Ships is on Sunday, and live should be tomorrow, Thursday. Take care. And Build Trumps should be out today.